They think this is some kind of game. They are blinded by their own superiority complex. These were the words spoken by Russian President Vladimir Putin toward the end of February 2024, when speaking about the then recent comments of Emmanuel Macron, France's president. Macron had claimed that he couldn't rule out the possibility of French troops entering Ukraine at some point during the war, which stirred up controversy all over Europe. Many in NATO initially decried Macron's comments, claiming that there was no possibility that any NATO forces would enter Ukraine. As for Putin, he did what he does best when confronted with a threat: make threats of his own. Putin said that all Western nations, which is essentially Putin's code for NATO, must understand that Russia has weapons capable of hitting targets on their territory. Then he made the big threat. All this really threatens a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons and the destruction of civilization. This was far from the first nuclear threat that Putin had levied since the beginning of the war, but it was perhaps the one most directly pointed at NATO. Putin's message appeared to be clear: don't ever cross the red line and get directly involved, or the entire world will suffer from the consequences. The threat has backfired. Rather than scaring NATO away, Putin's threats of nuclear annihilation have simply led to the organization realizing that it needs to become more organized. It has to be capable of countering the Russian threat and do so in such a way that Russia will be completely overwhelmed. That's why NATO is now preparing, so it's ready to deploy up to 800,000 troops into Ukraine at a moment's notice. Those preparations are the subject of today's video. We're going to examine exactly what NATO is doing to get ready for sending 800,000 troops into Ukraine, as well as why it's doing it. We'll also answer a vital question: what is likely to happen if NATO actually does go to war with Russia? Let's start with what NATO is doing to prepare. It all started in January 2024 and the organization of what would become the largest series of drills NATO held since the Cold War. Those drills were collectively called Operation Steadfast Defender 2024, and they took place between January 22nd and May 31st. Reuters reported on the details, noting that the operation would include around 90,000 troops from all NATO allied nations, along with 50 ships that ranged from destroyers to massive aircraft carriers. NATO would also practice how to deploy its aerial might, with a collection of 80 fighter jets, drones, and helicopters taking part. Add to this a massive 1,100 combat vehicles, including 533 infantry fighting vehicles and over 130 tanks, and you had an operation unlike any that NATO had held in decades. What was Operation Steadfast Defender's goal? To rehearse how US troops could reinforce the forces of their European allies by deploying as quickly as possible onto the NATO alliance's eastern flank if war were to ever break out with a near-peer adversary. Of course, near-peer can only mean one thing in the context of these drills and their location: Russia. Chris Cavoli, one of NATO's top commanders, outlined the operation in more detail. He told reporters that Operation Steadfast Defender would primarily focus on the execution of regional defense plans NATO has drawn up to deal with the threat on its eastern flank. The drills would occur during a simulated emerging conflict scenario with a near-peer adversary, he claimed, before adding that the operation would demonstrate NATO's ability to rapidly deploy forces from North America and other parts of the alliance to reinforce the defense of Europe. The exercise dwarfed Trident Juncture, which took place in 2018 and involved 50,000 participants, with the only NATO exercise in recent memory that was larger being Reforger. That took place in 1988, toward the end of the Cold War, and involved 125,000 people. Cavoli also noted that the second part of Operation Steadfast Defender would place a focus on the deployment of NATO's Quick Reaction Force to Poland. That location is important. Poland offers routes into the Balkan states near Ukraine's north, as well as the Baltic Sea. It also offers a direct land route into Ukraine from its southeast borders. Other nations involved included Germany, which acts as a central hub for incoming troops, as well as countries like Norway and Romania, which sit on the fringe of the NATO alliance. Think of Operation Steadfast Defender as a prelude of what may come. It was NATO standing directly in front of Russia to say that it was ready to deploy massive numbers of troops rapidly to deal with any threat it could pose in Europe. It was also a response to the threats Putin had been making since the outbreak of the Ukraine war. Granted, the operation was planned to start before Putin made his February threats in response to Macron's comments. However, it's telling that these threats gave NATO no pause for thought during the rest of the operation. It continued through to mid-May regardless. Still, it was only 90,000 troops. That's a number Russia could potentially deal with, especially given that Russia is likely preparing to enforce a second round of mobilization that could add 300,000 soldiers to its forces in Ukraine by the end of 2024. But as we said, Operation Steadfast Defender was just a prelude. NATO's real plans are far grander, and they involve preparing to deploy as many as 800,000 troops to counter the Russian threat. In July 2024, Newsweek reported that the German newspaper Der Spiegel had claimed to get its hands on top-secret military documents from NATO. Within the pages of these documents lay plans to create what Newsweek calls an arterial highway throughout Europe, and involving the United States, that would allow NATO to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops against Russia if the need ever arrived. Germany will serve as the beating heart of this arterial highway. The report claims that Germany's highways, railways, and ports will serve as the launching points for troops onto the Eastern Front. They'll offer not only direct passage into Ukraine, but also enable NATO to transport troops into Poland and to bases in countries like Romania. If you recall from Operation Steadfast Defender, these were the countries that were directly involved in NATO's troop movement exercises during the first half of 2024. Newsweek's report goes on to point out that the arterial highway won't just be the transportation method used by up to 800,000 NATO soldiers. It will also enable the transportation of weapon systems, as well as around 200,000 armored vehicles and tanks. Most worryingly of all for Putin, the plans would enable them to move all of these soldiers and their equipment to the Eastern Front within 3 to 6 months. Two aspects of Germany's logistical infrastructure will make these plans possible: its ports on the North Sea and the A2 highway. Starting with the ports, the Center for Eastern Studies says that Germany maintains 19 seaports that open out into the North Sea. For context, this is a body of water to which Russia doesn't have easy access. To reach the North Sea, Russia would have to sail through the Baltic Sea, risking bombardment from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, and Sweden, all NATO allies, as it does. Or it would have to head north before doubling back on itself via the Norwegian Sea, which means attempting to bypass Norway, another NATO ally, before entering a sea that's bordered by the UK, Germany, Holland, and Denmark. In short, the North Sea is very difficult for Russia to control. Returning to Germany's seaports, they vary in size to include massive international hubs such as those in Hamburg and Rostock, to regional ports including Wismar and Nordenham. All would play crucial roles in deploying 800,000 troops to the Eastern Front. Not only could the ports welcome troops from the previously mentioned European countries, which would then be deployed via the land-based transportation routes, but they would also be the main point of entry for US soldiers. America would send its troops via the North Atlantic Ocean, arriving in the North Sea and into Germany. Add the ability to send transports into the Baltic Sea, which would carry troops into the Baltic states and Poland, and then onto Germany, and you have a powerful waterborne infrastructure in place. Then comes the A2 highway, also known as the Bundesautobahn 2. Starting in the city of Oberhausen in Germany's west, this highway stretches for about 300 miles to reach the outskirts of Berlin in Germany's east. Crucially, it ends close to the German border, providing a means for sending soldiers into Poland and then possibly onto the Baltic states to reinforce the Eastern Front. But there's a problem with the A2 highway. The route includes 230 bridges, all of which would be obvious targets for Russia in its efforts to prevent NATO from mobilizing. Taking out even a handful of those bridges, while not making the A2 useless, would force the hundreds of thousands of troops using it to divert onto other roads, thus slowing their deployment. NATO's plans have built-in contingencies for just such a situation. Bases are to be constructed along the entire highway to house, resupply, and feed the thousands of troops who will use it to travel. These small bases are going to be so frequent that any transport using the A2 will have the option to stop every 1,000 to 1,640 feet to resupply and rest. For context, the A2 is 300 miles, with each mile being equivalent to 5,280 feet. That would mean about 5 places to resupply every mile, adding up to a staggering 1,500 resupply points built into the main ground-based route that NATO will use to transport its 800,000 troops. Of course, that doesn't necessarily solve the bridge targeting problem. A Bundeswehr Homeland Defense Command spokesperson highlighted that when speaking about the leaked plans a couple of days after they were published. The planning takes into account not just one motorway as an axis of movement through Germany, the spokesperson claimed, but also many motorways and federal highways. In short, the A2 is just one example of several highways Germany is going to reinforce with masses of supply points to enable the transportation of NATO troops. There are other contingencies in place. A month before the NATO documents were leaked, the UK newspaper The Express revealed that NATO was in the process of creating 5 superhighways that stretch throughout Europe. Again, Germany will be the hub. 5 of its North Sea ports will welcome hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the US and other parts of Europe. However, other routes will be made available. One would see American troops land in the Netherlands, after which they'll be transported to Germany via train before using the same mode of transport to reach Poland. There will also be backup ports in Italy, Greece, and Turkey, with discussions in place for the 5th port to be stationed in Norway. 5 more options beyond Germany for landing troops. Those who alight in Italy could likewise use trains to move into Germany before moving on. Greece and Turkey would give NATO's troops the option to approach Russia via the Mediterranean, while offering the possibility of transporting troops by land into Bulgaria and Romania. As for a Norwegian port, it would offer an easy route into the Baltics via Sweden and Finland, as well as a potential passage into the Baltic Sea. Crucially, none of these corridors would be limited by local rules and regulations. All would allow free transport for NATO soldiers, cargo, and equipment without any need for hold-ups at borders. Newsweek provided more details about these land corridors in a June 2024 report. It noted that the plans for these land corridors have been in the making for decades. Italy will link to Slovenia, Croatia, and Hungary, for instance, with plans to also open the Dutch port city of Rotterdam to be used by the NATO alliance. Combined with Germany's focus on superhighways and becoming a hub for troops arriving via the North Sea, a complex logistical web emerges. Half a dozen countries, once Norway is added into the mix, will serve as landing points for troops from the US and the rest of Europe. Each will provide different passageways to the Eastern Front, creating contingency upon contingency. If Russia does happen to take out bridges on the A2 highway, for instance, it'll still face the prospect of troops flooding in through Italy, Holland, Greece, Turkey, and several other countries. The idea is simple: create so many entry points that Russia isn't able to prevent the mass deployment of troops. But that brings us to another question. Why is NATO working so hard to create and reinforce this logistical network? After all, it's not like there isn't already a heavy US presence in Europe. America's military already has 100,000 people stationed throughout Europe who are there to help defend the continental states, provide a quick crisis response, and handle training duties. The US Navy also has its 6th Fleet stationed in Italy, along with the revived 2nd Fleet operating in the North Atlantic. Add to this the bolstering of the American footprint in Europe between February 2022, the month of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and today with the addition of another 20,000 troops, and you already have a substantial presence. The problem is twofold. That presence may not be enough, and European countries still need to provide ways to properly mobilize those troops in addition to their own. So the first reason NATO is preparing all of these land corridors and options for transporting troops into and around Europe is logistical. Having troops on the European mainland is not the same thing as having them on the Eastern Front, with every day wasted because of shoddy logistical systems being a day that gives Russia another chance to advance or strike the systems that are in place. And that brings us to the second reason for the creation of this vast network. NATO believes that it needs to prepare for a broader war with Russia. That's according to Jan Kalberg, who's a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He says that every road going east is a potential road for US and European forces, with the plans being put in place partially being designed to put pressure on NATO's continental allies. Their inclusion in these plans forces them to ensure the upkeep of the roads, bridges, ports, and rail routes that NATO intends to use. Think of it as a contingency. NATO hopes to never need those routes, but it has to guarantee that they're in good working order should the time ever come. As for the belief that NATO needs to prepare, that's been evident for some time. Until very recently, the majority of NATO's members were failing to reach the 2% of gross domestic product spending target that the organization recommends. This is highlighted by Forces News, which shows just how complacent many NATO members have become. In 2014, the same year that Russia annexed Crimea, only 3 NATO members hit or exceeded the 2% target. That rose to 5 in 2015 and 16, but dropped back down to 4 in 2017. Between 2017 and 23, the only time the number of nations hitting the target reached double digits was in 2023, when 10 nations managed to spend 2% or more. Bear in mind that NATO now has 32 members, meaning there were several years where only around 10% of its members were hitting the spending recommendations. As for the 2024 numbers, they represent a massive turnaround. 23 of NATO's members have increased their military budgets to the point where they'll reach or exceed the 2% recommendation. That's enormous news because it showcases that NATO's continental membership is making a concerted effort to prepare militaristically for the prospect of war with Russia. The rhetoric coming out of NATO has also changed during the course of the Ukraine war. In the beginning, NATO was extremely wary of suggesting that Russia's invasion was a signal that Putin may have grander designs for the rest of Europe. That's why so many European nations were so slow to cross the red lines, which are actions that could provoke Russia to provide weapons and permission for Ukraine to use those weapons in Russia. The rhetoric has been changing throughout the war. This is perhaps best represented by Rob Bauer, a Dutch admiral who also serves as NATO's military committee chief. He made it clear that NATO was preparing for something big. Speaking in Brussels in January 2024, Bauer said, "We have to realize it's not a given that we are in peace, and that's why we, referring to NATO, are preparing for a conflict with Russia." While not a commitment to sending troops into Ukraine or onto the Eastern Front, Bauer's statements were a clear signal to Putin, "We're getting ready to fight you." That brings us back to the logistical preparations NATO is making. It's one thing to say that you're preparing for war, it's another to demonstrate that fact. One of the reasons Europe is making such in-depth preparations to be able to shuttle 800,000 troops onto the Eastern Front is that it wants to show Russia that it's taking Putin's threats seriously. That's a far cry from the complacency that has gripped Europe for so long. The increases in military spending, the changing rhetoric from NATO's leaders, Operation Steadfast Defender 2024, the largest military training exercise NATO has undertaken since the Cold War, and of course, the leaked plans for transporting troops around Europe. All are signals to Putin that Europe is getting ready for a fight, and that, crucially, it's doing what it needs to do to ensure the US can properly support it in that fight. It's a classic representation of the adage, if you want peace, prepare for war. Speaking of complacency, we come to the third reason why NATO is creating its new logistical network. Its previous rapid response plans simply weren't strong enough to deal with the Russian threat. We can see this from NATO's official documentation relating to its Readiness Action Plan back in July 2016. Just 2 years after the annexation of Crimea, it was clear that NATO wasn't taking the Russian threat as seriously as it should. That plan revealed that the NATO Response Force, or NRF, contained just 40,000 troops. Granted, this was over triple the 13,000 it had in 2014, though even that number shows that NATO was nowhere near ready to quickly react to a Russian attack if it happened. The 2016 Readiness Action Plan showcased a growing NRF, but one that was still far too undersized to handle Russia. It also offered minimal details about the logistics NATO would rely upon to get those troops to appropriate locations. Simply put, it wasn't enough. Consider the fact that Russia's active military numbers 1.32 million people, with a further 2 million in reserve. This is a country that has lost over 580,000 soldiers in Ukraine already, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, and experienced over 70,000 casualties in just 2 months in the Ukraine war between May and June 2024. These numbers indicate that Russia can throw hundreds of thousands of soldiers at wars for which NATO could only respond with 40,000 troops as recently as 2024. Hence the need for these new logistical networks. Now that they're in place, NATO is showing Russia that it won't be dealing with the complacent version of the organization that it may have faced a decade ago. Putin can't make the same threats because NATO has the capability to deploy 800,000 troops within 3 to 6 months, and crucially, every country in the alliance is working together to ensure that those plans are actually workable if the time comes. Again, it all adds up to a clear message for Putin. NATO is ready to fight. Finally, we come to the fourth reason why NATO is investing so heavily in its plans for creating an arterial highway throughout Europe. It knows that Russia is capable of hitting almost any target in continental Europe with its ballistic missiles. These targets include bridges, such as those present on the A2 highway, and ports. As of 2021, Russia has 7 operational missiles capable of traveling at least 5,000 miles. These include the submarine-launched Bulava and Shtil, which can travel for 5,157 and 6,835 miles respectively. The other 5 missiles are all intercontinental ballistic missiles, starting with the UR-100, which is capable of traveling for 6,213 miles, and ending with the R-36, dubbed the Satan by NATO, that has a range of 9,941 miles. This is all without mentioning the many missiles Russia has with multi-thousand-mile ranges that fall outside of this top 7. The distance between Moscow and Paris is just 1,764 miles. The distance to Berlin is even shorter at 999 miles. In other words, Putin was absolutely correct in his statements that Russia has missiles capable of hitting targets in every major European city, at least in terms of those missiles' range. Hence the need for the arterial highway. If NATO wants to effectively transport 800,000 troops, it needs to have backup plans available for whenever Russia decides to make use of these missiles. With the arterial highway, NATO now has backup upon backup. All of which brings us to the final question we'll ask in this video. What happens if NATO goes to war with Russia? Thanks to the arterial highway, NATO will be able to instantly transport hundreds of thousands of troops to every key strategic location it may need to fortify throughout Europe. The pathways it has into Poland open it up to the Balkan states, with Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia likely to serve as the front lines in the ground war. Opening up the options of ports in Norway brings that country, along with Sweden and Finland, into the war, giving NATO a good chance to control the Baltic Sea. And with Mediterranean ports being opened up, NATO will have every potential front covered. Even Turkey could play a key role here. Opening up the Turkish Straits to NATO ships would allow NATO to quickly take control over the Black Sea, creating inroads into Crimea as well as another entry point into Ukraine. Speaking of Ukraine, it's worth noting that this is one of the few continental European nations that isn't a NATO member. So not only would Russia have 800,000 NATO soldiers to contend with, but these soldiers will be joined by the 900,000 active military personnel that Ukraine offers. That creates a fighting force of 1.7 million people within months of a war between Russia and NATO starting, around 400,000 more people than Russia has in its active military. Granted, Russia will be able to use conscription and its mobilization efforts to supplement those numbers, but it would still face a combined NATO and Ukraine that has 1.7 million well-trained troops, which will be going up against an army containing increasing numbers of old reservists and conscripts who are poorly trained and rushed to the front lines. In a conventional war, NATO should overrun Russia, at least in Ukraine. It would easily push the Russian fortifications back with the help of Ukraine's forces and create a new front line from which it could attack Russia on its own territory if needed. Add to this that 800,000 NATO troops would just be the starting point. As of March 2024, NATO's members combined to have 3.42 million active military personnel, providing an ample source of manpower to fight against Russia, which is already struggling with training and conscription issues. A conventional war, backed by the arterial highway, should work out in NATO's favor. However, there are a couple of wrinkles to consider. The first of these is that Russia is not without allies of its own. June 2024 saw it sign a cooperative defense pact with North Korea, which contains the condition that one will come to the aid of the other if either faces an attack on its own soil. North Korea has a military of 1.32 million active personnel, though it's likely that these soldiers aren't as well trained as their NATO equivalents. Russia would also face logistical issues in shipping North Koreans over to the war's front, issues that NATO is already handling thanks to its arterial highway plans. Iran and China could also be factors. However, Iran is dealing with issues of its own as the threat of war with Israel looms ever larger. As for China, there's just as much chance that Beijing chooses to sit the war out to focus on its interests in the Indo-Pacific as there is for it to join Russia in a war in Europe. After all, a war between NATO and Russia would weaken both, which is only a good thing for China. The point here is that Russia's allies aren't as organized as the 32 countries that make up NATO. Where NATO can bring 800,000 troops to the fight within 3 to 6 months, it would take Russia much longer to convince its allies to send reinforcements, assuming it could convince them at all. That leaves us with one more thing to consider: unconventional warfare. In other words, even NATO's overwhelming ability to move 800,000 soldiers around Europe quickly doesn't counter the Russian nuclear threat. In desperation, it's possible that Putin could decide to turn to his policy of using nuclear blackmail to control the situation in Europe when faced with the prospect of a war against a rejuvenated and organized NATO. He has the firepower to do it. As the Arms Control Association points out, Russia has 5,580 nuclear weapons, 1,549 of which are strategic warheads that are already targeted at key locations in Europe and the United States. It also has plenty of missiles capable of reaching those locations as noted before. NATO has counters to this threat as well. Both France and the UK have nuclear arsenals based in Europe, reaching a combined total of 515, many of which are likely targeted at Russia. And of course, the US has 5,244 nukes of its own, with 1,419 of those being tactical warheads. If Putin chose the nuclear option, his predictions on global devastation would likely come true. Whether he's willing to go that far remains to be seen. For now, NATO has plans in place to shuttle 800,000 troops throughout Europe. What do you think of those plans? And do you believe they would help make NATO the clear victor in a conventional war with Russia in the future? Share your opinions in the comments section, and thank you as always for watching the video. Now go and check out why NATO's largest mobilization terrifies Russia, or click this other video instead.